Hello, everyone. We're in the middle of Holy Week. So today's reading is for Maundy Thursday in Year C. There's a few different readings for Maundy Thursday, but in this one in Year C, they give us a passage from John. And before we get into that, I know we've had at least one from John before, but the Gospel of John portrays Jesus, I think, most as a spiritual being, even sometimes leaving the human side behind a bit. The positive side of that is that the writer of John, I think, most captures Jesus as someone who is recognized as true nature, a realized person, that kind of thing. But it does color a lot of a lot of the stories that we see in John, and that's going to continue through Good Friday tomorrow too. But for now, the reading we have is from John chapter 13, and it doesn't so much tell the story leading up to Good Friday. Instead, we get um, Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and then the commandment that follows. So to read first, now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already decided that Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, would betray Jesus. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from supper, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered, You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand. Peter said to him, You will never wash my feet. Jesus answered, Unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you. For he knew who was to betray him, and for this reason he said, Not all of you are clean. After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had reclined again, he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, slaves are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So, wow, there's a lot that we could dig into here. The first I think there's a good illustration of John as a writer here, right? Just in this, near the top in verse 3. During supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God. And that's what leads to these next actions. Now, I like that in two ways. The first is here's an illustration of John, I think, seeing Jesus as at least a spiritual being, but recognizing something of Jesus's true nature, even if maybe John doesn't see it quite himself or herself. But knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, right? There's something about the unity with source there, right? The that Jesus's self nature, Jesus's understanding at this point of his true self is in God, right? The earlier it's I and the Father are one, but here's just another expression of that. Given all things come from God, was going to God. Again, that fits with also Adyashanti's view of the crucifixion being sort of the death of self. Here we would have Jesus as self, still having a sense of self, but united with the divine or with reality, not a separate self in that sense. Um, and so we can see, in a sense, that no self-realization even there. I know, I just said the death of self, at least from Adia's point of view, is at the crucifixion, but the unity of self with the divine, and having no separation between is in a sense that at least the death of ego, right, or the realization of no ego, and no self in that sense, at least. And then the second thing from this, right, is that that's the preface, right? Knowing these things, he got up and did the foot washing. And so that I think is very interesting. And that's John, I think, in a really cool way, not just writing about Jesus as a spiritual being separate from humanity, but actually having that realization and then acting in the world, right? The expression of his humanity here is in the foot washing. Um, and there, I mean, we could highlight again a lot, but jumping all the way down, what have I done here, right? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for that is what I am. And so if I, being that, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. And then slaves not greater than their master, messengers not greater than the one who sent them. So here I think one way of seeing this is now not just Jesus's life or statements of Jesus, about Jesus as an expression of the mythological, a mythological expression of the spiritual path, right? But here we've got Jesus as teacher, right? And Jesus as teacher to this group that's been with him. And so John first is saying, hey, this is what I understand of Jesus at this point, right? Jesus's realization. And then Jesus turning that realization and saying, okay, look, you disciples, recognize that in me. And now I'm going to turn it on its head, right? Do the exact opposite of what we've done collectively, which is don't worship me, don't put me up there, right? But you call me teacher and Lord, and that's right, right? He's not shying away from the realization. He's not saying, that my recognition isn't really there, or that, yours is all the same as mine or anything like that. But look, I've turned around and washed your feet, right? And that's the back and forth with Peter earlier. But I am, I'm no greater than where I come from, and neither are you, right? First, I am no greater than what I've come from. And so you all realize that, right? Don't put me on a pedestal. Go to your own realization. Go. And here's just a very practical, right? Whenever you think you may have a realization that's higher, that's the ego grabbing onto something, right? That's the self creating a new identity around that. And this is just a very practical, human expression undercutting that. So just beautiful there, I think. And then along the same vein, right, turn to the new commandment part, right? And again, we get John's statement of, a poetic expression of Jesus's realization, right? Son of Man's been glorified, God's been glorified in him, again, suggesting that unity. And if God has been glorified in him, will also glorify him in himself. All that, all these non-separation expressions, right? Not the way we would put it today, but in the mythological context of the time. I mean, it's just sitting right there. And then where I'm going, you cannot come. I do really love that one. We're going to just sit on that for a moment, right? Because I mean, whether this is what it means or not, I'm gonna say that this is what it means, right? The I cannot go there, right? I mean, so he's saying where I am going, but if we already take that John has given us that Jesus has this recognition, that realization, that that no separate self, that unified realization, then the statement here is, look, your separate self, the one I'm speaking to, cannot come there. That's where I'm going, in the sense of, yeah, you look at me as an ego and I know you do, and that is returning to source, right? That is going to be true nature in its pure form, with no self expression, no self filter. And you cannot go there. The ego cannot go there. The self cannot go there. But then again, the shift right back into the humanity of it, right? You may, I give you the commandment that you should love one another just as I have loved you. you also should love one another. So again, I think this is, and Jesus shifting straight to teacher, right? So first the realization, and then shifting to teacher. One, the sort of esoteric speech teaching, very subtle. You may not get this right now. You cannot come, okay? But not meaning a barrier, right? Just the you can't get there. And then the very next statement. And so what do you do? Now, this is again evoking, I think, what is already true, what the true nature that already exists, speaking directly to that in all of us, all the disciples, but all of us. Love one another, right? And if you not as a should, and again, every should, this is, I think one of the unlocking keys. Every should is actually a description. Every apparent make your ego do this is actually an expression of what's already happening or what true nature is already doing. So the new commandment, you should love one another, right? Does not, in that sense, I mean, it's also a very good practice. I mean, and it can be a practice that the ego does and then fail and then does well, right? Does good in the world, but also fails at because the ego, the separate self cannot possibly fully love the other. It can't. And if we really truly live that and really truly follow it all the way to ground, we'll discover the failure in that. But just as I have loved, you also should love one another, then is actually speaking to the part that can do that. And it already is, right? And so evoking that part. So both through the practice itself, um, leading us there, but also speaking to the part that's already there. So John is always a fun little ride, I think. And we'll get more tomorrow for Good Friday from John's account of that story. Um, but again, there's lots of different things we have for Maundy, Thursday, and if we do really follow the 3 years of the lectionary, we'll get some of the other statements of that. But this, I think, again, is just John going back and forth. Jesus as spiritual being describing the realization that Jesus has at this point, the recognition, that sense of an identity that isn't rooted in a separate self, and then the transition, right, to what does that look like in the world, that maybe not unique, but that gets special emphasis in the Christian tradition, um, and that can be really useful for all of us who are exploring all of these, how to live this out in the world when it's fundamentally just, as always, just living out what is.